WandaVision episode 5 called On a Very Special Episode. And it was indeed a very special episode. It managed to answer some questions, giving us a little bit more context, while at the same time keeping that mystery alive and raising even more questions. And then that ending. Obviously, there's going to be tons of spoilers ahead. So if you're ready to dive into spoilers with episode 5, let's do this. Welcome to Durbania. I'm Durbin, and this is my spoiler talk review for WandaVision episode 5 on a very special episode. And it is a very special episode. This is probably one of the most interesting episodes in the season so far. And one of the things that I really liked about this episode was the pacing. And I think what made the pacing of this episode so good for me is it went back and forth between inside the hex, the bubble that they're in. Darcy Lewis calls it the hex because of the hexagonal shape. I thought that was pretty fun. So inside the hex, you have the show WandaVision going on. Outside the hex, you have the real world and S.W.O.R.D., and you have characters like Monica and Agent Jimmy and Darcy as they're trying to solve this mystery. So cutting actually back and forth between inside the hex and outside in our world was very interesting to me. It picked up the pace and it kept that very Marvel feel. Like I said about episode 4, it was the very first episode that felt so MCU to me. And it was very cool to see our world. Now diving back in, we get our world and the world underneath the hex. And that just made it even more interesting as they're trying to figure out what on this green earth is going on. And one of the other things that made this episode so interesting is just Vision himself, his investigation into the truth and trying to uncover the reality of what he's seeing. And it's all these like simple little things that lead to these big things. And one of the primary things I noticed in this episode, Wanda and Vision are out of sync. You know, they've always been in sync. Even though Vision is questioning his world, he's questioning his reality and questioning what's going on around him, there's still a certain wavelength that Wanda and Vision were on together. And whenever Vision would sort of deviate from it, there'd be a cut and he's back on board. Well, that seems to be happening less and less. And Wanda and him are losing sync with each other. And one of the things that was cool about cutting back and forth to the under the hex to our reality is that we get more context filled in. Like S.W.O.R.D., how they showed on security footage 9 days earlier, WandaVision breaking into a S.W.O.R.D. facility and stealing Vision's body, which, you know, was killed like 5 years previous when Thanos pulled the freaking stone out of his head. But it's interesting because I feel like in the shot, it's like Vision's body is in pieces all laid out, but she steals his body and then suddenly this whole hex thing begins to happen. This whole WandaVision thing begins to happen. So on the one hand, it answers questions. We see Wanda making a deliberate choice, break into S.W.O.R.D., steal Vision's body. And they make note of the fact that he had specific wishes. If he's dead, to be left dead because he didn't want to be anybody's weapon. But in her grief, she's not respecting his wishes and has taken his body and has now created this entire reality where he's alive and they have a family together. So it answered questions by giving us more context and it raised even more questions. And so I like that whole aspect of it because then as we go back into WandaVision, it makes what's happening inside the hex, all of the sitcom stuff, it makes it even more intense. For instance, the way it opens, you know, Vision's getting suspicious of the fact a neighbor seems to show up with just what they need at just the right time. So Wanda can't get the babies to sleep. Now that's interesting because she even talked about how she wanted to do a shortcut and do a little magic and make the babies fall asleep and it didn't work. But there's a slight expression on her face where it seems like she's surprised that her abilities didn't work on the child. Now, is that part of her sitcom antics? I don't think so. I think she's either losing control or her abilities don't work on those children. So that was kind of an interesting little moment. But when Agnes comes in and we have that blooper moment where Vision's nervous about Agnes holding the babies, it throws Agnes off so she like doesn't know what she's supposed to do in this moment. She goes,
should we just take it from the top?
And, you know, Wanda's like kind of panic-stricken, gets the ball rolling again, and then when Vision pulls her aside to ask her, like, what was that? Here's Wanda trying to play it off like it's nothing, like just a sitcom joke to try to cover the reality of what just happened there. But no weird cut, no actually starting that over. It just played out. That's interesting to me because in other episodes, when something like that happened, like the beekeeper guy coming out of the sewer or Vision really questioning reality, there was a cut and it would start over. Why didn't that happen this time? That's an interesting question. And so it leaves Vision to stew on this, to really ask this question, like, did you seriously not see that? And then again, when it comes to the kids finding the dog, when they're all of a sudden aged 5 years or something super fast, and they find this dog and they want to keep Sparky, and Agnes comes over at just the right time with the doggy house, just what they need. Here comes Vision's suspicions rising up again. So here we have Wanda and Vision out of sync. And so Vision goes to work. Now this to me was one of the most interesting scenes when, he's making the computers and all the funny stuff like Norm, like, oh, it's a Rolodex and a calendar and all of this rolled into one. Will it get me a wife? And Vision's like, well, one day it will. But it's interesting because using this, he comes across an email from SWORD, a classified communique. But it seems to do something odd with the hex, the spell that they're all under, because everybody in the office reads it together as if they're at church repeating something. It's like, what is that? And then it stops and everything goes back to normal. But when he touches Norm's head, he gets the repressed personality of the real Norm underneath. The real Norm is scared, panicked, wants a phone to call his sister, has a family. He's in pain. What Wanda's doing is causing him great pain. And so Vision puts him back under the hex to kind of temporarily relieve him of the pain. And so Vision now realizes his world isn't real. And that's just incredibly fascinating. I mean, you take that and combine it with what we're learning in the real world. That Monica, she's had blood work done, and they did the scans on her, but the scans are coming up blank, and now they got to redo the blood work. So it seems she goes under that hex, and matter is being rewritten. She went under that hex wearing a Kevlar vest, and her crazy, weird 70s outfit was like 87% Kevlar. So she starts shooting it, and the bullets bounce off it as it's like hanging up in that other room, and it's like, holy freaking monkey's uncle. And so they take an 80s style drone and fly it through so it doesn't have to be like digitally redone so much or remastered because it fits the time period. And as it goes in there, I mean, you see Wanda just ticked off that it's been invaded again. And then that jerk face, didn't tell Monica that they put missiles on it and they shoot at Wanda. Yeah, talk about compromising a situation there. I mean, I guess I get what he's doing, but are those children real? There were freaking children present. And Wanda, I think she's rightfully mad at that moment, but comes through the bubble. And it's the Wanda Maximoff we all know from the MCU. That was a really epic scene to see Wanda step outside the bubble. I mean, this is Wanda full-on acknowledgement. This is reality. Behind me is not reality, but behind me I got everything I want, and I'm going to protect it. And she seems very unconcerned with the thousands of lives that are now under her control. And so it's sad because I really do like Wanda in the MCU. I think she's such a great and wonderful character, and this does add like so many complex layers to her. But how could this end good for her? Where could this end in a good place for her? I mean, she earned the Avengers' trust when she was working against them in Age of Ultron and became an Avenger herself. But how do you earn back trust when it's like, what state is the Avengers even in at this point? And so it's just like, wow. So I feel sad for her of what she's going through, and then she re-enters the hex in the bubble and tries to keep everything the way it was. Now, here's a really interesting thing to me. Monica said when she was under Wanda's power, it was painful, it was violating, but one of the other ways she described it is like she could feel Wanda's grief. She felt the weight of that grief, which is a reason that I think Monica's going to be a help because she's recently lost her mother. She's come back from the blip and found out that her mother's gone, so she's grieving too. So there's this connection between Wanda and Monica. But what is so interesting, and I got mad, I yelled at the screen, you hypocrite, because this scene where Sparky the dog is dead in Agnes's bushes, and the twins find this dead dog. Now, the twins were babies. They became like 4 or 5-year-olds, and then they aged up to 10 so that they could keep the darn dog. So the dog died, and they plead with Wanda to bring the dog back. Now, I find it interesting because even Agnes is like, wait, you could do that? Wanda is telling them don't age up any further because they look at each other like they're going to age up. And she's like, don't run from this pain. Don't age up. and she's trying to help them manage their grief. And that's why I yelled, "You hypocrite," because it's like, here she is grieving and she needs to listen to herself. So it actually kind of adds layers to mystery, especially some of the reveals that came a little bit later on. Like, she was unaware she even began this. She's unaware of how it started. So there are some interesting factors that we're dealing with here. But then you got Vision. He's seen it. He knows. And so even burying the dog, it goes very odd that we'd find a dog in one day and be burying it that very night. But then she tries to end things, like the end credits of the TV show begin to roll. The ending music begins to roll. But Vision won't have it. And again, she's not cutting things. It's not like rewinding the scene like it did earlier. It's playing out. Something definitely seems to have changed. And what's really interesting is how Vision loses it. And you realize he loses it because he's afraid. He has no memory of his life before this. So that's an interesting question I didn't know I had that is now answered. He doesn't remember his life before this event, and he's scared. And so to see him kind of raise up and fly in a defensive position, her fly and the power starting to emanate from her hands, it's like this crazy, scary moment, this major confrontation that was inevitable, and it was amazing how it was executed. Because one of the things you learn in this moment is Vision had a theory that this all was subconscious, and then she's only just recently become aware of it. But in the course of the lines, I think she confirms that reality, that she wasn't aware at first, because she said she doesn't even know how this started.
I don't know how any of this started.
But she seems to be hanging on to it. Since it's here, and since she has it, she's hanging on to it. So does that really make her villainous? I mean, it makes her consumed by grief. And then what's interesting is the doorbell rings, but she didn't summon the neighbor. And this is the part where it's crazy, right? She opens the door, and here we have her brother, Pietro. But it's not. It's Peter Maximoff. It's Peter from the X-Men universe that until Disney acquired them was so completely separate, there was no hope of a crossover. What does this crossover mean? I mean, it's hilarious to have Darcy watching the TV and be like, she recasted her brother? Like, just the shock on her face, because it's like, we all knew that that is supposed to be her brother. I mean, he says it, but the point is it's like, she recasted him, but it's Pietro from another reality, from a whole separate comic book universe. Is this the first sign of the multiverse? Is this the first sign of that multiverse coming together? Has she breached that multiverse? Is he accidentally pulled in as she's searching for her brother and thinking of her brother? And now that he's pulled in, he's under this spell, and maybe he'll start to break out slowly? Like, there's so many questions. So is this the beginning of the multiverse? Are we seeing it? How crazy is it that the son of freaking Magneto, the brother of Wanda, shows up on this show? What does that mean? Not just for the future of the show, but for the future of the MCU. This was a freaking huge reveal. So what did you think of this episode? What did you think of these big reveals? And last of all, Pietro showing up, but not really Pietro, Peter from the X-Men universe. What does that mean? Let's talk about that in the comments. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button to become a Durbanian. Hit that bell by the subscribe button so you're notified for my next WandaVision review, my next movie review, ranking video, theological analysis, trailer reaction, or anything else I do here. I'm Durbin. Thanks for checking out Durbania.